So welcome everybody to the United Nations Global Innovation Hub, the UNFCCC Global Innovation Hub Pavilion and meeting room, which is tucked away in a corner of the COP30 Blue Zone site in Belém, where we are watching through the window. The daily rain has just stopped, but was coming in violently before. So this session, very appropriately, is on securing cities, securing urban and bioregional futures. And we're going to take deliberately both an urban settlement and a bioregional perspective. So thinking of human settlement in a broad sense and without the usual rather simplistic binaries of what is a city and what is not. And we are going to focus on the relationship between risk and resilience, and between regeneration and the opportunity and necessity to create and shift towards lifestyles, infrastructure, patterns of life, economic structures, and the political economy of life affirmation, of life-affirming futures, and look at both sides of this coin. So the scene setting for this that I would like to do, and I'll just introduce myself. My name is Kirsten Dunlop. I am the CEO of an organization called Climate KIC. The KIC stands for Knowledge Innovation Community. We are Europe's foremost climate innovation agency and community, focused on working across the world in 60 countries from outcomes back, where innovation is used really to try and understand how to catalyze the conditions for systemic change, for whole systems change. And I'm here representing and delighted to partner with a movement, an organization of multiple organizations choosing to act together for speed and scale. This movement is called the Collaborative for Systemic Climate Action, and it represents organizations, all of whom implement in very different, diverse and complementary ways, trying to overcome in our own actions and trust building and a joint action together, the hyper-fragmentation of work going on. So in this context of a COP of implementation, a COP calling for action, and particularly for collective action in a Brazilian context, hosted and joined by the Brazilian presidency, this is a group of organizations coming together to discuss how we put collective action into practice to get to the speed and scale that we need in this last 5 years of the famous decade of action. So this topic around securing cities, securing and thinking about the transformation of bioregions. If we think about human settlement in the concentrations and patterns we have, these are some of the greatest stranded assets on the planet if we choose one path in the road, if we continue to go down the path in the road that we're on. They are also the places, the concentrations of human settlement that we desperately need people to stay in so that we can secure environments that are more efficient with their resources, that are more circular, that are able to think about regeneration in life-affirming ways, in ways that are as compact as possible, as intrinsically interdependent, interwoven with nature and with one another as possible. So the opportunity to really understand the need to think in terms of resilience, the opportunity to think in terms of transformation in a way that looks at aggregate effects, at the combination of businesses, of livelihoods, of live streams, of resources, of places, of infrastructure, and including natural infrastructure in much more creative and innovative and systemic ways. So what we're going to do is consider two perspectives: the world of systemic risk and the world of transforming and amplifying nature-positive, life-affirming transformation. So we're going to think of both of these as a kind of a bifurcation moment, in many ways actually mirroring what is going on in the world, where you have a large part of the world running on fear, uncertainty, resilience, security, a hyper-focus on competitiveness, protectionism, drawing back behind boundaries and lines, and an increasing redirection of capital towards military expenditure and protection. And you have other parts of the world opening up their hearts, their chest, their mind, their sense of relationship to the notion of it is possible to live well, and it's more effective, it's more efficient, it's more affordable, it's more life-giving. And we have both of these kind of extraordinary yin-yang energetics happening in the world at the moment. So we're going to discuss that in the context of human and natural settlements and really explore how do we meet the moment by understanding what's going on and by using both of these energies. They help one another. It's genuinely a yin and a yang. So I'm going to start This first session is going to be around systemic risks coming home to roost, the implications for cities and regions, the implications of 2 degrees by 2040, 3 degrees by the end of the century. What does it mean to enable action informed by risk and volatility? And Indy, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to suggest maybe try and keep yourself to sort of 3 to 5 minutes or so that we then get a bit of a conversation going with you and with Tom and with Lenio. And then we'll take the other side of this coin. So Indy, let's start with you online. And if you could just briefly explain who you are as you come in, so you give your voice to that.
Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Indy Johar. I'm from Dark Matter Labs, and I'm just going to dive into the debate. I think one of the things that I think when we start to look at, say, a 2-degree future in 2040, the thing to worry about is not just the 2 degrees, but the volatility. And what we're starting to see, we'll lose almost certainly one of the major food baskets by 1.7 to 1.9 degrees. The loss of a food basket will have the volatility effects, and in terms of price, inequality will have a runaway effect on both those issues. And I think what we're starting to face is the runaway effects no longer just being about, the AMOC current is increasingly becoming fragile. I think we're starting to look at large-scale effects as part of that. Now, the challenge that we face is, I think, not when these events finalize their full manifestation. The challenge that we face is the volatility that starts to happen well in advance of that event. And the volatility has a disproportionate impact on effectively those that are most vulnerable. And what it will drive is whiplash effects into inequality. And those inequalities will almost certainly drive social breakdown much quicker than I think people are anticipating or worrying about. And I think in that context, what becomes really vital is how do places start to drive a security agenda, but a security of provision of and a continuity of an agenda in terms of energy, water, critical minerals, cognitive security. Remember, when we add that vulnerability, there's also an appetite for weaponization of that vulnerability, which is already what we're seeing. So building the security agenda, I think, is really vital now. I think this is not about kinetic security. It's about the continuity of foundational economies and their provision. And it's also about understanding that your security the UK security cannot be provided in the boundary of the UK. UK security is entangled at the level of the Amazon, at the level of the Antarctic, but also on critical food, critical soils around the world, and critical materials. So we start to appreciate security from a systems lens, a foundational economy lens, as well as an entangled lens. And I think those are going to be critical. And I think it also opens up a different form of politics, which is not rooted in left or right, but in actually stability and security, which I think constructs a different political theory for the transformation. And I think it opens up a different conversation about, I think, beyond market theories on universal basic provision of nutrition, universal basic provision of energy, not out of kindness, not out of forgiveness, but actually out of preserving the social contract, which I think is fundamental to the preservation. I'm going to use this number and close there, is that if you were to add the total dwelling wealth of London, just London itself, London has 3.8 million homes. They are all priced at 668, average price is £668,000. That means the total dwelling wealth of London is 2.52 trillion. So I'm not asking people to be kind. I'm asking people to recognize that in the stability of assets, they're going to have to preserve the social contract. And linking the social contract to asset theory, I think, is really important, and thereby linking that to stability and societal stability as a foundational good for the transition becomes a key part of the political theatre. And I think it is one dimension, as you rightly say, of the transformation. It's about building that, but I think it has the power to be fundamentally transformative onto the baseline foundational economies, which I think is vital. I'll stop there, Kirsten. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Indy. And so really this notion of understanding a widened notion of security, that resilience and security are not about protecting a moment of access to resources, but underpinning the core stability of the human system of political economic systems. I think we just lost them. No, are they back? But really, as you say, the function, the core economic stability function that we will need to enable ourselves to do any of the implementation that we are here busily talking about in Brazil. Lenio, can I come to you for the perspective? Are you still with us?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Can I come to you for the perspective of heat? So this notion of how we understand the risk that is coming down and how we use an awareness of that risk to mobilize and increase or speed up action. What is your perspective given the work that you are leading?
Hi, Kirsten. Hi, everyone. I think heat has been an incredibly interesting perspective that we are increasingly taking on, because it moves one's imagination very clearly from the global to the very local. And it kind of links the idea of global warming with very intense and very dire impacts on the ground. I think that it also does something else in relation to governance, which has to do with the fact that because heat is such a multi-sectoral, it has so many multi-sectoral impacts that kind of go from energy utilities and technologies being at risk to transportation, to social services or health services being extremely pressured and stressed, to the natural and built environment, of course, agriculture, labor, economics, all of them are affected by heat in ways that sometimes are unexpected, and it forces different governments, both at the local level but also at the central government level, to deal with a much more integrated way of dealing with the problems that arise. They haven't been very successful up to now, but it forces the issue of looking at something from a much more in a much more integrated way. Unfortunately, we've seen, economics and politics kind of not following each other, right? People have been talking about that when we were in Rio a little while ago, how, we always thought that politics are following economics. So when things kind of get cheaper, like things are going to go that way. And this is not the case right now. There are other exigencies and other kind of absurd kind of issues that go against any normal expectation of what is good for the people and what the social contract has been, as Indy said, like the minimum kind of things of the social contract have been rationally, conceived as a baseline. But so if we kind of see that, if we look increasingly at the world that has incredible irrationality and volatility in the way that it is going on right now, and we don't really know if it's going to normalize or if we're going to still keep going in crazy irrational places. Cities are indeed a place where we can kind of put our heads down and feel like we are more grounded. And what happens in cities, I just wanted to bring an example, because when I was deputy mayor in the city of Athens, which was about 10 years ago, a long time ago, it was in 2015, and we had an economic crisis, and we had climate crisis, of course, and then we also had, it was after the Syrian war, we had 1,500,000 refugees go through the city of Athens, which is basically through one square in the city of Athens. We had 1,500,000 people go through one square and live in the streets and kind of be totally destitute and exposed and extremely in incredibly precarious kind of conditions. And the city had to deal with it at the same time that it had to deal with the fact that the banks were closing and we didn't have, we were figuring out how much gas we had for the waste collecting trucks and how much cleaning stuff we had for the kindergartens, et cetera, right? So you have this kind of crazy situation where somehow, like, great and surreal solutions come out of these conditions. And we've seen that again and again, especially in societies that have some kind of social resilience. We do see amazing solutions and different kind of things come together in really beautiful ways. But this is like when we're dealing with crisis, when we're dealing with the long-term thing, which is the scary part, which, as you guys said, when we have a planet that's heating up slowly and we're slowly, there are parts of our populations that are already dying and parts of our agriculture that's already dying and parts of our ecosystems, et cetera, that are going, let's say, from Mediterranean to arid, et cetera. All of these things, it's like, we have this long-term deterioration, which that's what worries me. Like, can we create the kind of in this kind of more long-term, we seem not to be able to create the larger structures that can deal with that and that have the creativity. And Kirsten, I know you've been trying to do this, and I think another example, and I'll finish at that, just happened today, and I'm very happy that it was launched today, the Beat the Heat effort, which just finished like about an hour ago, the launch in another room in Belém, which is trying to bring together all of the different efforts from different organizations and from networks and from banks and all that kind of stuff, together with cities and governments to try to figure out what is out there, how can we best map what's available, where the gaps are, how can we support, because the need is so urgent and so big to deal with extreme heat today, that this is like a big mutirao and a big kind of effort that I'm just hoping it's going to have great legs and be a good example of one of the things that can be kind of growing out of great need.
Thank you, Lenio. And I'm acknowledging that you're speaking there as the Global Heat Officer for UNEP. So your sense of the importance of trying to bring a set of disparate efforts around heat as a channel for mobilizing greater action is very, very pertinent to all of the work that you're doing. Can I then pick up on this notion both from Indy and from you and come to Tom on the extent to which we actively lean in to helping people understand the scale of the risk, the enormity of their challenge, and the problem of this long-term steady accumulation, but also some of its exponential mathematics. As we often hear Indy explaining, 3 degrees of warming overall is 8 degrees in cities. That's why heat is so critical. Excuse me. How do you see in the work that you've been doing, Tom, around the notion of dark matter, or as Indy's entire foundation is around, this kind of hidden handbrakes mechanism within the global system? How do we take the global system and make it work for us, work almost against its own vested interests and towards transformation?
Okay, yeah, perfect. So I am part of an organization called IIED, the International Institute for Environment and Development. And actually, we go back to the early 1970s in working on human settlements, predominantly in the global south and predominantly with informal settlements or slum dwellers and so on. So just to give you a sense, there's about 1 billion people at the moment living in informal settlements. And when I say informal settlements, I mean partly without security of land tenure, often with rudimentary shelters, not upgraded, off the grid in some ways, not recognized by their cities or within their jurisdictions and so on. And in some ways is brushed under the carpet, in many senses, or are very vulnerable to evictions, which we've seen going up an awful lot. And then just to give you a sense of where we're looking forward, with the volatility that Indy was describing, and with the fact that we're already seeing the breakdown of many of the bioregions supporting some of the cities, the rates of urbanization and the rates of people moving into those informal settlements are going up. Dhaka in Bangladesh, I was visiting last year, 2,000 people a day arriving in the city to be absorbed into the city and its system, predominantly within those informal settlements. So we're seeing a phenomenal trend already that is likely to get even more pronounced. But the other dimension of what IIED does is to say, are there ways in which we can appreciate the hope, the resilience, the frugalness, the ways of adapting when you actually don't have access to those formal systems? And it just so happens that we are in a room where there is a photo exhibit, albeit keep falling off the wall, of a program that I...
Called adaptation.
Well, the adaptation could be stick it better on the wall.
Exactly.
Yeah, but it highlights some of those stories of hope that start from a hyper-local recognition that actually with working with young people, with communities, of remaking neighborhoods, of being resourceful, and then bridging across different neighborhoods and different cities is ways to act and find hope and security in situations where often you are off the grid and you're powerless within formal systems. And so that is part, I think, of the future where we recognize the networked ability of hyperlocal innovation and bring young people to the fore. And you can see the great stories of hope. The other dimension of IIED's work that you're referring to is that we were looking at, what would happen if the global system could actually help those people? Because at the moment, it really doesn't in many fundamental ways. And we've been referring to that as hidden handbrakes. Hidden handbrakes being things that we barely ever talk about, we barely ever write about, but are fundamentally there keeping the current damaging system in place. So things like the underpinnings that we have with credit ratings. What does credit ratings actually recognize or not recognize? What's the way in which we think about currency and currency fluctuations, which fundamentally extract billions every year from global south economies? What's the way in which we have an international system of trade and legal protection that actually stop governments being progressive in the way that they might want to work because they're fearful of being sued? This is a very short list of actually what is a very long set of elements that is really keeping that damaging system in place. And I think the way we can actually start to tackle some of that, one is to make sure we highlight what the critical systemic risks are fundamentally to that system itself, reflect it back in, but then also to highlight what the alternatives are, to work with communities and the power of people to show what it means to be progressive, to think differently about human security, and to do so in the places that we know that people are moving into very fast and accumulating risk, but they also accumulate opportunities for innovation.
So
and I think it's that,
literally security economics and security politics, almost having existing systems starting to move things differently as it realizes its own risks.
Yeah, or recognizing that that system starts to progressively weaken as you emerge a new system from the bottom up, where there are countless phenomenal examples of this. But I think until we start to really build it, so just to one final point is, just think about climate finance, right? What proportion of climate finance actually reaches informal settlements, some of the biggest accumulations of risk on the planet? It's less than 1/10%. Because actually the reason is that climate finance requires the government to say, yes, I want to do this project. And the moment they say, yes, I want to do this project, is about them recognizing that part of the city that they don't want to recognize, so it doesn't happen. But that's just to give you an insight of the how far we've got to go to change that system to actually make it work and scale local innovation.
So let's think about this in terms of almost like two theories of change that are indeed, as Indy said, entangled. One, a theory of change where people begin to get afraid. And let's hope that in COP, as people walk around and start to get heat exhaustion, they begin to understand what heat really feels like. And they mobilize to a certain point. And perhaps we do have global systems starting to think about shifting their own core incentives and penalty mechanisms. But on the other hand, as we know from COVID-19, that doesn't sustain action for very, very long. And we need to work out what is the other narrative that feeds a sense of possibility and deep survivor instincts with hope as an outcome. So let me come to you, Sandrine, to kind of turn this around and think about how do we think about cities and the politics and economics of large concentrations of human settlement, informal and formal, as places where we amplify an alternative way of thinking about possibility.
Yeah, and I love this, the handbrakes analogy, and maybe what we need to think about is how do we hack humanity back into everything that we do? So maybe it's from the handbrakes to the human handshakes approach. And if we were going to take that line further, I think that we need to understand that the underlying systems that are not enabling us to progress within our urban environments, but in general, are the ones that have actually entrapped society now since post-war. pretty much. And this is exactly what the Club of Rome started to speak about in 1972. And I think these compound effects that we're feeling now is the reason that many of us are so fearful, but also pissed off that we've known for the last 50 years, if you look at the limits to growth that was published in 1972, that we were going to hit a wall. I mean, every single scenario that was published by those MIT economists indicated very clearly that in 2020, we would start to really hit a wall. So here we are, we've hit a wall. And we've hit a wall at a time where we also have seen a pandemic, which has had a huge effect on human populations. And those compound effects between the pandemic, between the fact that we have not taken care of our natural resources, and we are now emitting far beyond what we should be emitting, and we've gone beyond 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries, is the mess that we're in. So we are both trying to prepare cities for impacts and compound effects, and yet at the same time, while we're preparing those cities, and we're not doing a very good job, we're not actually shifting the underlying system, which is broken. So we are continuously still talking about growth. Well, lo and behold, this year for the first time, the UNDP has announced in its Human Progress report that human development is going backwards, not forwards. Now that is a huge aha moment, or should be, for governments to say, hold on, we actually should not be continuing with the neoliberal capitalistic market economy that we have in place, because it's not working. It's actually making people's lives and livelihoods worse. So that's the first aha moment. The second aha moment is the one that we had, myself and Johan Rockström and other scientists, when we realized that if we wanted to stay within the planetary boundaries, we needed to address inequality and poverty. And most exactly as has been indicated by Tom, the inequality and the poverty is happening predominantly in urban centers, but also we have not built corridors to rural or bioregions, which really create those handshakes. If we were really talking about handshakes and trying to build that link in human settlements, we should be thinking about rural and urban together. Mm-hmm. And that's really taking into consideration, okay, who is feeding us? Who is using the land? How are we using the land? Both within our urban centers, because our land use is completely wrongly used, as well as within our rural centers and our rural land use. So I think this is a moment. It's a real aha moment, which unfortunately is coming at a time when the geopolitics are going completely in the wrong direction. And that is where we as a community, those of us that are trying to do, as Indy says, understand the risks, communicate those risks, both from a cost perspective, because that is where we will get the insurance sector to come in, we will get most of the investment community to come in, and hopefully we'll finally get the business community come in, and some of them are coming in. And maybe then there will be enough of a pull for those heads of state who are still denying that there are any risks to actually bring them in. But then we also need to bring people on the journey. And actually, I don't think that's the hard part, because many, as you've just said, Tom, of those communities already have the solutions. They have been adapting. I mean, those of us who are privileged, like myself, who don't have to live in the conditions that we're seeing here in Belém, and we're all trying to adapt, those of us who are privileged are going to have to start to learn to actually live in the similar conditions and build our urban environments to be able to do so. We actually need to learn from Africa. We need to learn from Asia. We need to learn from Latin America, because those communities who've been working in very difficult conditions have come up with the solutions that we need. That's the exchange of knowledge, whether it be the indigenous knowledge, the frontline knowledge, or the basic knowledge of how to adapt and be more agile when actually you're confronted with a variety of different impacts because your living conditions are not privileged in the way that so many of us are. So I think that the beauty of what's happening now, if we can actually grasp it, is to start to listen to other ways of living, other ways of building, new systemic shifts that we actually need. All of those warnings that we've been having from our indigenous brothers and sisters, but also from MIT economists, who told us a long time ago that we were beyond the limits to growth. And that's the awakening that we need now. And we need to bring both people on the journey, but we definitely need to figure out how we can hack the system from a geopolitical perspective as well.
Thank you. I'm picking up particularly this notion of how do we work through an understanding that if you think about the way in which we nurture trees from the roots, and yet we've constructed so many of our solutions as if we're feeding only the fruit. How do we reverse the whole way we think about the solutions, the implementation, the action space, so that it's designed for the root systems of human systems, human societies, human fairness, human well-being, and our sense of the future? So Atossa, in that case, let us come to the wisdom of understanding. One of the parables that I live by is that Cherokee parable around the idea of two wolves and the question around which one wins between hope and despair, the one you feed, because it reminds me of how often I forget, and we all forget, to think in the dynamics of change. What it is that we feed is what we get. What is your perspective on how we learn to feed a life-affirming alternative to the risks we're running?
Thank you, Kirsten. Yeah, so in the sense that our worldview defines how we relate to nature and how we see ourselves as part of the tapestry of life, I think it's a philosophical debate, but it's also a practical one. When you look at your own body, every cell in your body does two things. It keeps itself alive while cohering with the rest of your body to keep the host alive. In our worldview and the way we have, over the last several thousand years, have so-called progressed, we have generally left, been looking at separation, the paradigm of separation. And that's how we built our cities. That's how we've designed our economic system. And that's how we've designed our political system. And every other geopolitical system. So I think it's a civilizational crisis moment, and we are lacking kind of a metaphor for how to live in harmony with life, how to design our systems to seek to be in coherence with life. And, our only measure of value right now is money. And so as long as the drumbeat of money and growth is the drumbeat, is the operating system of this planet, our problems are going to continue to get worse. While we are, and this is something that I also realized growing up in Los Angeles and bringing water from 500 miles away and filling our swimming pools. I worked in the water conservation field, and I realized that when we looked at the value of being ecologically coherent with life, we were creating more jobs, we were reducing our capital investments, we were creating healthier drinking water and healthier emissions in the oceans, which is helping our. So when we look at the win-win, when we twin the financial and economic prosperity with ecological flourishing, we actually find the win-win sweet spot. And this is the thing that has been forgotten in a lot of the climate market debates around earnings and returns, and the fact that everything is looked at oxygen. We're looking at forest, we're looking at timber, oil, carbon, everything separately. We're not measuring the whole of vitality of life. And I think that's what we're missing. We're missing new metrics that not only measure the ecological functions beyond GDP, but they actually look at the coherence and vitality. How do our systems add up to more than more than some of the parts? And in the bioregional movement in the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Alliance, it's very clear that what happens upstream affects communities thousands of miles all the way to Brazil downstream. If there's an oil spill, if there's a mining, dam breaks, if there is deforestation in the headwaters, you can truly map and see the direct impact of those actions in communities downstream. In a system, in that same way, we looked at bioregions as the new hopeful way of empowering the local knowledge, empowering local governance, and working on that flourishing, the economic and ecological flourishing as the combined goal, because everyone in that bioregion does want to work, does want to have a livelihood, and depends on fresh water and clean rivers and, you know, the movement of life and wildlife. And so we can see that as a microcosm of a planetary, of the macrocosm, we could actually move to a river basin watershed system of governance. That's what we're experimenting with in the sacred headwaters and source of the Amazon in Ecuador and flowing from the glaciers all the way down to where the Amazon River is first written on the map in Iquitos, Peru. And we're seeing that, you know, if we want to really protect the fish populations, we have to address illegal and legal mining upstream. We have to close, you know, we have to stop cattle ranching. We have to support the ecosystems that capture water out of the air. In the same way, globally, the Amazon generates 20% of the world's fresh water. You've seen it here. That system is the, you know, the atmospheric rivers that bring rain all the way to California. So we also have to make linkages that the breadbasket in California needs to pay a fee to the Amazon to protect the forests, because the forests and the watersheds are inseparable. The rain is beckoned by the trees, the low pressure system, the rain is beckoned by the trees. It rains and then the trees lift and evapotranspire that water back up in the sky. A river bigger than the Amazon River flows every day from here around the planet. In fact, 90% of Rio and Sao Paulo's water come from here. And then here in California, we get spring rains that we need for our breadbasket from here. So this idea that we're one body, that the rainforests and the ecosystems are basically vital organs and that we are part of that organ. And really we focus on shifting values and shifting signals and bringing the power of decision making in the face of the geopolitical realities. I think the referendum movement to demand climate action and the work on organizing local communities for land rights is really powerful. And the last thing I'll say is that wealth needs to be redefined. You talk about trillions of dollars in, you know, London as real estate. The forest is the true foundation of wealth. The communities that hold millions of acres of rainforest and are fighting a detriment to themselves to protect it, and they have protected it for millennia, they can't get even a, you know, $5,000 loan at the bank because they have no collateral. This is the problem. We have to see wealth, the true wealth, as nature's flourishing, and then I think we can, you know, reorient ourselves in the ecosystem and reorient what we're focusing on as far as where we're going.
And change those feedback loops in social, economic, and political. So Indy was referring to the notion of new institutional forms or new economics around universal basic nutrition. And you are referring to almost universal basic vitality and ecosystem services that we learn to value as we currently value that drumbeat of money. And that's a wonderful bridge then to Joshua. I wanted to ask you, in this perspective, you are representing generations, particularly in the African continent, but generations who are inheriting these entangled woven streams of heightened risks, massive correlated systemic risks, huge ingenuity within resilience, but also the opportunity to shift, to fundamentally recode and shift our understanding of what aspiration means and what are we aspiring for. How does your work play into this notion of how we secure the future and move to life-affirming economies?
Thanks. Hope you can hear me. Yeah. First of all, I really want to thank all the speakers because you've said things that sit on top of my mind all the time. And to something that, Tom, you said, I was sort of 2 weeks ago, I was in Johannesburg with, you know, CFOs and sort of chief auditors and procurement officers for governments, thinking around how do we move finance differently in the continent of Africa? And these are people who, you know, are moving sort of big companies and helping advise to move money. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about, I'm using this story to set it. One of the stories I shared with them was the fact that we cannot reimagine the future if we keep working with the systems we believed worked in the previous century. So to your point around, and one of the questions I asked, how do we evaluate risk? And why do we constantly have to keep framing we need to do risk investments in Africa? And this is a language I heard when I started this work. You know, 15 years ago, and I still hear it today. For some reason, we believe that we need to de-risk and we need to avoid risk. And the reality is that the risks are compounding. So you won't be able to avoid it. You have to work out how to work with the risk. And how to work with that risk comes to a fundamental base way of living. And to your point, Sandrine, around dehumanizing and bringing sort of hacking humanity back into this system. It's trust. That is the fundamental key of what is missing right now in the ecosystem that we live in. So here's the story. If I grew up in a very poor rural family, and the only way I was able to access education was because my parents were involved in a local savings and loans that was running purely on trust from one neighbor to the other. And a lot of you will have this in your, if you look into your history, you have this sort of way of moving money and finance ecosystems within communities. Every member puts a cent into a pot, and at the end of the month, it goes to one person to help them manage their life. The next month, it goes to another person. There was no strict documentation around this, of purely trust-based, and people knew they could count on it when they needed that money. And this is what took a whole generation of us through formal education for us to be able to have a job, represent our countries, and be able to do the work we do now. What prevents that informal economy to be able to access funding now? Why is it impossible for them to access credit? Because we've eliminated this fundamental belief of trust. The reason is simple. We are halfway through this decade of action. It's also that decade that I've seen the most polarization within our field of work. It is the decade that has seen the most erosion of intersectional thinking. It is the decade that I've seen the most in siloed approaches can get us there faster. And by doing this, we have risk being able to actually deliver change that actually lasts and are durable. So when I think of the generations that I work with, which is very intergenerational, majority being young people, this is very much on their front. A lot of people ask, why are the youth movement? Why are they not on the street now? Why are they not mad about what is happening? Because they are not choosing a singular topic and being mad about it. They are seeing the interconnectedness of all the issues. They protested for climate, and they're going to protest for racial inequality. They're going to protest for economic inequality. They're going to protest for forests. They're going to protect for water ecosystem. They're going to protest and demand for everything. But they cannot pick one singular issue and say, this is how we get there. And to be able to do that, we need to make collaboration and the collaborative infrastructure itself investable. And currently, that doesn't exist. We've all been stripped of our ability to become intersectional leaders because philanthropy and the finance system as a whole reward siloed thinking and siloed areas of expertise. And I think this is where our work comes in as the Youth Climate Justice Fund. We designed a fund that primarily focuses on funding youth movements that really want to champion intersectionality and being able to think of the world as a collective. It will surprise you, and to do this example, walk around and talk to any researcher who works on cities and try to have a conversation with them around rural development. They'll tell you, that's not my place. I don't care about that. You talk to one who works on cities about rural, they'll say, rural areas, that's not my forte. I don't want to talk about that. But yet these two systems are super interconnected. If you starve cities of that innovation security that Tom, you're mentioning about, that has a huge implications on our ability to rely on those bioregional areas to be able to support us with the air we breathe, with the clean water that is supplied within our taps and we have access to in the cities. That is bringing in populations from those rural areas back into city to compound the risk that we have in cities. We cannot depart these two systems. So I think that through our work, funding groups like the SDI, Slum Dwellers Initiative, and other organizations that are really focusing on how do we build capacity and support young people, regardless of whether it's a bioregion or urban centers, to be intersectional, to be able to protect and build new ways of economy, where there is shared income and redefining wealth, as you said. And then the third part of it, which is very important, is narrative. The narrative that exists currently is feeding into the system that we so much dislike. So whether it's hope or despair, we spend the whole of this year doing a series of events called Relentless Hope. Because hope is a constant. And if you've lived through an extreme weather event, right, whether it's heat, whether it's flooding, whether it's a cyclone, there's one thing you see. And a lot of people don't have this experience. You have a massive flood and a flash flood, very onset. You wake up, it's there, everything is gone. You have a very small window to act to protect your most vulnerable asset, whatever is remaining, whether it's human lives, whether it's your crops, whether it's your whatever you have, a very short window. There is no despair. You move it quickly into hope. You have a very short window for despair, and then you switch into hope, and then you find people mobilizing and supporting each other and bringing things together so they can protect what is left and be able to keep moving. And I think that we've lost that part because stability is something that we've had a comfort of having for quite some time. And we've lost how to really keep hope alive and be able to have the despair needs to be there because if we are humans, we need to have despair. But keeping the despair short, moving into hope and being able to act with hope is something that is very important. And I think for that to happen, we need to change our narratives. That is very important. And I think that we need, very, very important, we need to build trust and justice into the finance system in a way that people who are living with the issues, waking up each day, whether in cities, whether in the forest, whether in the bioregional economies, waking up each day knowing that their knowledge is an asset. Their knowledge is investable. And they can enter into relationships having a very sort of peer level partnership with all of us to be able to build that future that we need. And I think that is going to be fundamental to the young generations of today, because if we do not invest with them to have this thinking, we would simply be replicating the issues that have created the situation we are in now.
Thank you so much. That is the most extraordinarily beautiful, rich summary of so many elements that are being discussed in COP and that are so critically at stake. I'm going to ask us to close this session, to come through with every single one of you, including Indy and Lenny online, and thank you very much for being with us late at night in Europe and in the US. The one reflection on from what you've heard, if we think about this notion of feeding despair and hope and using the energy, thinking about jujitsu moves, what is it that each of you is reflecting on that we could use to keep these two types of energy with us to really mobilize the kind of implementation that we're here trying to advance with an exponential dynamic of change? Tom, maybe I'm going to start with you. Just checking, Indy, Lenny, are you still with us?
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. I'm going to go Tom, Sandrine, then Indy, Lenio, and then Atossa and Joshua.
So the thing I'm going to pick up on is, as several people have mentioned, is the way that we always start with risk. The thing that you mentioned, Joshua, about the de-risking part. And maybe it's a super boring thing, but the more and more I've understood it, the more important it is how about we consider credit ratings and the way in which we price money from the perspective of opportunity and resilience and thriving, rather than the perspective of risk and despair and loss. If we were to change that little tiny bit, the jujitsu move, it would be radically change the way in which we think about the future of finance on this planet.
So I'm going to pick up the hope. And as you know, Kirsten, I often paraphrase a quote, which for me really speaks, which is hope is not some flowery thing. Hope is about grit. Hope is about getting up and fighting for what you believe in. So I think it's really important that we remember as we bring in that grit, that actually we have the tools in the toolbox. We have a series of countries who have already transitioned towards well-being economies. We have a series of communities who have opted to do things differently and actually are more resilient. So that hope and that grit is ensuring that we keep on bringing out those alternative futures and fighting for them, not giving in and being complacent and what I would say complicit with the existing systems that are going to continue to push us into despair and not actually give us the alternative future that we need.
In fact, Laurence Toubiana yesterday speaking to business saying, speak up and speak loud now. You are already doing this. Speak up. Lenio, what's your jiu-jitsu move listening to this panel and thinking about this COP of action?
I was going to say the same exactly as
Hang on, you're on mute, just 1 second.
I was going to say the same as my I can't remember her name, the lady that spoke right before me. I so much believe in being brave and fighting, and actually recognizing the enormous amounts of effort put out by so many people that are that have the grit and the desire to push, and that's what's going to save us both. Make us swim through the most dangerous and most horrible waters, but also make us actually be able to deal with the darkest and also lean into the lightest kind of things. And we need to be brave, and we need to really take risks now more than ever, because we don't have the luxury not to.
Thank you, Lenio. Indy.
I'm at a retrofit festival in Birmingham, London, where we're talking about community-driven retrofit. And the number one conversation that I think has become really important is the value of being human is diminishing relative to the value of assets in the economic sense. And I think we have to look this problem in the eye. No amount of saying, oh, we need good health, we need this, is going to work for an economic system in which the value of human is fundamentally diminishing. So I think we have to construct a new argumentation and also reposition what we think the value of being human really is relative to an asset future. So my plea is that I don't think we can win this argument with the economic system that we've had of, if you provide health and well-being, the economic value of humans increases. It doesn't, unfortunately, because the value of being human is diminishing in the economic mindset. And I think we need to, and the reason why I think we have to engage this problem properly is that I think there's a fundamental crisis of what does it mean to be human. And in our current crisis, the value of being human is, in our current economic model, is diminishing. And I still find we're fighting. We were talking about, people saying, what's the value of a house in terms of health outcomes? And unfortunately, when you value that relative to a diminishing value of being human, it's very low, if not negligible. So I think there's a fundamental war going on, and a site of resistance is really what does it mean to be human in an economy. And I think we have to expand and reimagine what it means to be human if we're going to really win and resist, I think, the reduction of what it means to be human, reduction of being human in the economic sense. So I have hope, but my hope is not rooted in the delusion, I would argue, of arguing in an old economic model. I think we're going to have to argue and build a whole new theory of argumentation in a different way in order to win this war, because I think it's fundamentally a different type of conversation. So the act of resistance of being human is in every small favelas that Tom was talking about. That is the site of resistance of being human. And I think we have to reimagine the site of resistance of being human. I think this is a fundamentally different type of conversation. So my only thing is, how do we look the problem in the eyes properly to be able to have the right fight?
Thank you, Indy, very much indeed. Joshua, your jiu-jitsu move.
Well, it's I have a lot of things on my mind, but I think one that I would definitely mention into some of the points that I've been mentioning is around, I think we got our narrative wrong, and we need to heavily work on this. It's not fluffy. I think it's something that really goes a long way, and we need to get that narrative right. And part of that, I would say, is that we need to think around, very, very importantly, think around, if we want to have the change that we're really looking for, it's most likely not going to come by everyone currently being locked up with things that we are committed to. So to be able to move away from what we are currently committed to, which by far contribute to the system you're still talking about, we would need to make that hyper-level collaboration investable so people can unlock the ability to form new partnerships to build these new systems that we're talking about. I think this is currently one of the biggest challenges I see, that we all want to see a particular kind of change, but we are also committed to a whole bunch of things that we need to deliver on, and they are very important, don't get me wrong, But if we keep doing that, we're not going to be able to move very
It's
quickly. So
like that
how do we
wonderful-
how do we make collaboration with all partners and infrastructure that we can invest in so we can do that more?
Well, that whole analogy of immunity to change. What do we have to actually let go to make some space for something different? Atossa, the final word.
What gives me hope is that the answers we're looking for are already demonstrated in complexity of ecosystems that see coherence, circularity, reciprocity, and elegance, and even creativity, and that we are trying to design our economic system from our brains when we need to really look at 3.7 billion years of R&D that the Earth has done and learn from that. And what gives me hope is that the bioregional movement has legs. We now just came out of a accelerator with over 70 bioregional organizers around the world that are doing this in different ecosystems. And that rights of nature is growing. Soon nature could hold itself. Rivers could own themselves. Mountains could own themselves. They could be on board of directors. We could create a value system that recognizes the primacy of the web of life, of which we are not separate. We are part of life, and that we need to basically be good cells in a body of the living earth.
And then that comes to the radical collaboration that you are describing. And that's a wrap from the Collaborative for Systemic Climate Action. Thank you very much, each of you, for participating. Indy, Lenio, thank you very much for joining us.